What actually happens when two people go quiet on each other? Not a dramatic blow-up, not a tearful phone call, not one side chasing while the other pulls away. What happens is something much stranger, much quieter, and far more revealing. It's the moment the real game begins, and almost nobody sees it coming because almost nobody understands what silence actually does to two people who once mattered to each other. We're taught to think that silence is the end of something, that when the texts stop, the story stops. But that's not true, and if you've ever lived through it, some part of you already knows it's not true. Silence doesn't end the story, it exposes it. It strips away every performance, every strategic move, every carefully worded message, and leaves only the truth of what each person actually feels underneath all that noise. Today, we're going to walk through exactly what happens in that silence for both people, on both sides, and why the person who understands this stage, instead of panicking through it, ends up in a position of power they never had while the messages were still flying back and forth. You'll see why silence rewires attachment. You'll see why the person who initiated the distance often unravels faster than the one who received it. And you'll see why, by the end of this, you'll never look at going quiet the same way again. Let's start with the part almost nobody talks about. The first few days of silence feel like nothing. There's almost a strange relief in it. No more overthinking a reply, no more checking a screen for a bubble that never comes, no more managing someone else's mood through a phone. It feels, for a moment, like freedom. But freedom and avoidance can look identical from the outside, and only time tells you which one you're actually standing in. Because somewhere around day 4, 5, 6, the mind starts doing something it wasn't doing before. It starts filling in the silence with meaning. And this is where the real psychology begins. When two people talk constantly, the brain has all the data it needs. Every question gets answered in real time. There's no room for imagination because reality keeps interrupting it. But silence removes reality from the equation, and a mind without data doesn't sit still. It builds a story. It fills the gap with memory, with worst-case scenarios, with idealized versions of what was lost, with sudden aching clarity about things that felt unimportant just days before. This is the part people miss. They think distance kills feeling. It doesn't. Distance concentrates it. Constant contact spreads emotion thin across 100 small exchanges a day. A reply here, a joke there, a passing good morning. Silence removes all the dilution and leaves the feeling undiluted, sitting alone in the mind with nothing to distract it. That's why people report thinking about someone more after the contact stops than they ever did while it was happening. You felt some version of this. Maybe not in romance, maybe with a friendship that faded, a family member who stopped calling, a version of yourself you quietly let go of. You know what it is to sit in silence and suddenly understand something you couldn't see while the noise was still going on. Here's a woman we'll call Mara, 31, living in a mid-sized city, the kind of place where everyone seems to be quietly getting on with their lives. She'd been texting a man for months. Nothing official, nothing labeled, just that slow, burning, almost something that so many connections live in now. Then, over something small, a canceled dinner, a joke that landed wrong, the messages just stopped. No fight, no explanation, just quiet. For the first 3 days, Mara told herself she didn't care. She kept busy, she didn't check her phone more than usual, or so she told herself. By day 6, she caught herself rereading old messages, not out of longing exactly, but out of a need to locate the exact moment things shifted. She wanted to understand. And in trying to understand, she started to feel things she hadn't let herself feel while they were still talking every day. How much she'd been shrinking her own needs to keep the conversation easy. How much she'd been performing calm instead of actually being calm. That's the shift. Silence didn't make her miss him more because he was special. Silence made her finally hear herself. And this is where the real game begins, not between two people fighting for control, but between each person and their own unfiltered mind. Whoever can sit with that mind the longest without breaking it with a text, without flooding it with reassurance seeking or performing indifference just to provoke a reaction, that person comes out of the silence changed in a way the other one respects, whether they say so or not. You stop chasing, you stop explaining, you stop performing certainty you don't feel. And in that stopping, something happens that constant contact could never produce. You become unreadable. Not manipulative, not cold, just quietly, fully yourself, without an audience to perform for. There's an old idea, one that shows up again and again across the history of philosophy long before psychology had a name for it, the notion that a person's character is revealed not by what they do when watched, but by what they become when left entirely alone with their own thoughts. Silence is that test. It doesn't create character, it reveals it. If you've ever sat in silence after someone stopped reaching out and felt yourself starting to understand something new about the relationship, write, "I understand now" in the comments. You're not the only one. Now, let's talk about the other side, the person who initiated the distance, the one who went quiet first, because their experience is almost never what people assume. The common belief is that the person who pulls away feels powerful, free, unaffected. Sometimes, briefly, that's true, but power built on avoidance has a short life shelf, because the person who initiates the silence still has to live inside their own head, and their own head doesn't stop working just because they stopped replying. In fact, something curious happens to the initiator that almost mirrors what happens to the one left behind, just on a delay. In the first stretch of silence, they feel in control. They made the choice. They set the boundary. They get to watch from a safe distance. But control and peace are not the same thing. And somewhere around the second week, a quieter, less comfortable feeling starts to surface. The absence of being missed the way they thought they'd be missed. The absence of a reaction to manage. The absence of proof that they mattered as much as they believed they did. This is where old patterns and new patterns split apart completely. The old pattern is to break the silence just to get a reaction, a message disguised as casual, a like on an old photo, just thinking of you sent purely to test whether the door is still open. It rarely comes from genuine desire to reconnect. It comes from discomfort with not knowing. The new pattern, the one almost nobody is taught, is to let the discomfort exist without acting on it. To recognize that needing to know you're still missed is not the same as actually needing the relationship back. Silence forces both people to face a question that constant contact always let them avoid. Do I want this person, or do I want the certainty that I still matter to them? Those are two very different hungers, and most people have never separated them until silence made them impossible to ignore. Here's a man we'll call Devin. No last name, no city necessary, because this could be anyone. Devin stopped texting a woman he'd been seeing casually, mostly because he felt like the effort had stopped being reciprocated the way he wanted it to be. He told himself he was fine, and for a while he was. But 2 weeks in, he noticed he was checking her social media more than he'd ever admitted to checking anyone's. Not because he missed her, exactly. He wasn't even sure he did. But some part of him needed to confirm that his absence had registered somewhere. When it didn't seem to, when her life online looked exactly like it always had, something in him deflated in a way he didn't expect. Not heartbreak, something smaller and more honest. The realization that he'd built a small part of his self-worth on being noticed, and silence had just quietly taken that away. That's the trap almost everyone falls into during the stage, whether they went quiet first or were left in the quiet. We start needing proof that our absence means something. But the moment you need someone to prove they miss you, you've handed them the exact power you are trying to take back by going quiet in the first place. The real shift, the one that actually changes the outcome of these situations, happens when a person stops needing that proof entirely. Not performing not needing it, actually not needing it. That's the difference between someone who's protecting their ego and someone who's genuinely at peace. And people can feel that difference, even through a screen, even through silence. If you've ever caught yourself checking to see if someone noticed your absence, write, "I've done this" in the comments. It's more common than you think, and it doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. Let's go deeper into why silence works this way, why it so consistently rearranges what people feel instead of simply ending it. Constant communication creates something psychologists call intermittent reinforcement when it's inconsistent, but even when it's steady, it creates a different problem: certainty without depth. When you know someone will text back within the hour, you stop wondering about them the way you'd wonder about someone who might never text back at all. Certainty is comfortable, but it's also flat. It doesn't ask anything of you. It doesn't force you to sit with your own attachment and examine it. Silence removes the safety net of certainty, and without that net, people are forced to actually feel the size of what they have or don't have. This is why breakups, fade-outs, and periods of no contact so often produce more honest clarity than the relationship itself ever did. Not because absence makes the heart grow fonder in some romantic, mystical sense, but because absence removes the noise that was drowning out the truth the whole time. You already know this from smaller experiences in your life. The friend you stopped talking to, who you didn't think about much until months passed, and you realized how much lighter your life felt without their constant negativity. Or the opposite, the person you assumed you'd forget easily, who instead grew louder in your mind the longer the silence went on, because some part of you had never actually processed what they meant to you while you were busy just existing alongside them. Silence is a mirror. It doesn't create the reflection, it just finally lets you see it. This is also where self-respect quietly enters the picture, and it's the part of this stage that matters most. Somewhere in the silence, a decision gets made, usually without a single word being spoken, about what each person is actually willing to accept going forward. The person who breaks first, out of anxiety, out of fear of losing the connection completely, often sets a precedent they don't realize they're setting, that they will always be the one to close the gap, regardless of what happens on the other side. The person who can sit in the discomfort, feel the pull to reach out, and choose not to, not out of pride, not out of games, but out of genuine respect for their own peace, sends a different signal entirely, even if the other person never explicitly reads it that way. It says, "I am not available to chase. I am available to be met." That's not manipulation. That's not a power move designed to control someone else's behavior. It's simply the natural result of a person who has decided their own steadiness matters more than someone else's immediate comfort. You are allowed to want to be met halfway. You are allowed to stop being the only one making effort. Wanting reciprocity is not needy, and choosing silence over one-sided chasing is not cold. It's one of the healthiest things a person can do for themselves, even when it doesn't feel that way at 2 a.m. If this is the season of life where you've decided you're done chasing anyone who isn't chasing you back, write "done chasing" in the comments. Let that be your line in the sand. So what actually happens when the silence breaks? Because eventually, in most cases, it does, one way or another. Either someone reaches back out or enough time passes that both people quietly move forward without ever speaking again. And here's the part that surprises people most. How the silence was handled almost always determines what happens next, far more than what was said before the silence began. If someone reaches out after weeks of nothing and finds the other person calm, grounded, and unbothered, not performing indifference, but genuinely at peace, that calm becomes magnetic in a way that anxious pursuit never was. People are drawn to steadiness. They can feel when someone has done real internal work in the quiet versus when someone has simply been suffering in silence, waiting for permission to reconnect. And if no one reaches out at all, if the silence simply becomes the ending, the person who used that time to actually process, reflect, and grow walks away from it stronger, clearer, and more equipped for whatever comes next. The person who used that same time to spiral, to obsess, to build a fantasy version of what was lost, walks away carrying weight they didn't need to carry. The silence itself is neutral. It's what you do inside it that decides everything. So let's bring this all the way back to where we started. What really happens when two people stop contacting each other? It's not the end of feeling, it's the beginning of clarity. It's not a battle for who breaks first. It's a mirror that shows each person exactly who they've become underneath all the noise of constant communication. The real game was never about who texts first, who waits longer, who seems less bothered on the surface. The real game is about who can sit with themselves, honestly, in the quiet, without needing the other person to rescue them from what they find there. If you're in this stage right now, if you're sitting in silence, wondering what it means, wondering if you should reach out, wondering what they're thinking, let this be your permission to stop performing and start actually feeling. You don't need to win the silence. You don't need to prove anything to someone who isn't even watching. You just need to become someone who can be at peace whether they come back or not. That peace is not a strategy. It's not a tactic to lure them back. It's the actual goal, because it's the only thing that was ever really yours to control in the first place. Whatever happens on the other side of this silence, whether it ends in reconnection or in a quiet final goodbye, you will walk away from it more whole than you were before, as long as you let the silence teach you instead of torment you. That's the real game, not winning someone back, winning yourself back. If this gave you a new way of understanding a silence you're living through right now, consider staying a little longer. There's a whole library of videos here built around exactly this kind of clarity, the kind that doesn't just soothe you for a moment, but actually changes how you move through relationships from here on out. If it resonated, subscribe, because we sit with these ideas together every single week, and I'd rather you not miss the next one. Until then, stay steady in the quiet. It's telling you more than you think.